Perhaps we can have Dr. Loader and Dr. Califf rejoin us because we're going to open the session to the floor now for questions. I think Dr. Zarin might have a lead general question for the group.
Actually, I was going to say I will save my question. Let the conversation evolve, and if we have a lull, I'll throw in a question or two.
Okay. Well, actually, before anyone gets up to the mic, we already have a question from the floor from Diane Paul of the as a patient advocate, specifically to the panel, but directly to Dr. Axson. In instances where patients don't improve while in trials, isn't there an obligation to allow patients to know whether they got the experimental therapy, since it may affect their future care if the agent is available off-label or approved in the future? So isn't there an obligation to allow patients to know whether they got the experimental therapy?
I'm the last person to answer this. I have never run a clinical trial, so I have to say that I'm going to go with the original consent, because what I said here is that we must stay with the original consent, and part of that consent process is explaining the possible outcomes of the trial to the participant at the outset. That process, I think, is absolutely essential to stick with it. Now, there may be cases in which the trial organizers just take a look at the results and they say, okay, we really must, for the good of the patients, unblind this trial. But I think that is not something that a journal would force or a funder would force. That is entirely an ethical issue for the licensed and qualified physicians who are actually running that trial and caring for the patients.
I would also add that the phrase that people use in that area is returning research results to the participant. And in this country, IRBs and the investigators, well, the IRBs oversee that process, and there are guidelines for when that's appropriate, which is extremely important, but somewhat different than what we're talking about here, which is sharing data more publicly, sharing de-identified participant-level data for the purpose of further research.
I mean, please comment. No, it's open to the panel.
Yeah, just a quick comment. Many of the trials we do, and there are pluses and minuses to this, but in many trials, people complete the randomized portion of the study and then are allowed to cross over onto the active therapy. So the problem is that it then becomes a single-arm study with no comparison group. And so anything that happens, whether it's good or bad, kind of tends to get attributed to the therapy, and that may or may not be right.
Yeah, I would just quickly comment that it's often done, and as Deborah said, there are certain issues that come up. For example, if there is a continued long-term follow-up, there may be reasons not to reveal the treatment, but that requires a separate consent when that is done, so that people know it. But I also think there should be an obligation to inform people about the vagaries of knowing what treatment you are on relative to whether you actually benefited. This is not a simple issue of knowing that you benefited because you got the active treatment and you felt better, for example, because that could have easily been a placebo effect. So there's a certain amount of discussion that's actually quite startlingly interesting when you reveal results, particularly to a group of people who have participated. The women's health studies with HRT were probably the best example of that in my career, where it was a devastatingly adverse or neutral, depending on how you look at it, impact, leading to really interesting discussions about what it all meant.
I mean, for the benefit of the individual who asked the very common sense question, why, if you participate in a study, why don't I get to know what I was on? I think what we're hearing here, and it's important to make the distinction, is that this is a very complex issue, which is almost the subject of a different discussion, because it has to do with the unintended consequences of revealing information that might not really be informative, as Dr. Califf just said, not to mention what's in the informed consent, but that the topic here really is not addressing identified, not linking data to individual patients. So I just wanted to make that point very clear. I think what we're talking about right now intentionally avoids going into that space. But the other question is a very good one, I think, for a different setting. Thank you.
My name is Cindy Gagan, and I'm a patient and an advocate. And I am an advocate for this data sharing. So I appreciate being here, and I appreciate you convening this meeting. As an advocate, one of the things we need to do is be able to explain the benefits of this to the public. And as I think it was Diane Paul's question is what we're basically asking is for participants to be content with summary level data. So as a participant who's invested in the clinical trial, now my case reports, et cetera, are de-identified and not connected to me, but they're going to be shared broadly. But I am the participant asking for a participant level data. And I'm not saying I understand the reasons for it, but it's still going to be a hard bridge necessarily to cross, especially when you come to things like incidental findings, not necessarily which drug I took, but you might find something else compelling in there, and it's just another issue I think maybe cross later. But if we're asking the public to accept summary level data, and then we're trying to benefit people by participant level data, we should be sharing the participant level data at the participant level, perhaps.
So let me take a first stab at this. I think that whether or not the participants in the clinical trial receive information after the trial about their own experience is separate from whether or not the participant level data in a de-identified way is made available to other researchers. So even if in a trial, or even if policymakers decided that participant level data was never made available publicly for research, it doesn't mean that the IRB decision to whether or not you as a participant got the data, it's just two separate things. So each trial would have its own guidelines about, and your informed consent process would have said what you would receive, and it's just a very separate thing from whether researchers have access to that information.
I'm agreeing with you, and what I said was that the research participants should have a right to the individual level data. I think that's a very important distinction from what the doctors are saying. I think that's a very important issue, but what I asked was that the individual research participants not try to identify themselves or anybody else in that trial. Now that may be pretty annoying to you if you're trying to make decisions about your life, but the clinical trial is not there for you to make decisions about your life. That is your treatment and your physician interaction. I think as part of the research activity, research participants can recognize patients like themselves within the clinical trial data and can make observations about the individuals involved that may actually either lead to research or be in themselves research activities. But I think you're engaging the individual level data with your unique perspective as a researcher.
Yeah, well, I mean, please comment more, because as we hear this, both the opening question and yours, Madam, do strike one is very important, because one can easily appreciate that from an advocate perspective or patient perspective, this does seem like a sort of almost arcane distinction that we make up here. And I think what's on the table is how do we communicate the consistency of how do we communicate the goals properly here? So I think we should continue this, because I think this question is important and hadn't really registered until we heard it. So maybe Dr. Loader first.
I will just be brief, but the matter that's raised is in some ways separate from what we're discussing, but in other ways not, because certainly when I began as an investigator in clinical trials, it was not standard practice to return to the individual investigators in the sites their own data. In other words, we did not necessarily ever learn which of our enrolled subjects had been on treatment or not. At least it was not standard to return that information. I'm happy to say that at least in academic medical centers, that's rarely now the case because we're not allowed to sign trial agreements that don't involve some level of access to the data. But I think that the lack of a sharing culture, especially earlier in clinical research, in part led to participants never understanding what happened to them.
Well, I want to thank you for that comment and say that if our goal is in part to restore trust and to build these relationships, then I think we first really have to listen to what people out there have to say. And if we're just talking today about how researchers can access data, it will seem as if we're self-serving, even as we're trying to promote society's best interest. And maybe it's true that we ought to think about the idea if the data are a societal good, and if we are indebted to those people who have participated, what's our obligation to them? And giving them a dense consent form that they've signed because they trust us. I mean, they don't really necessarily, let's be honest, understand deeply every line of that consent form, but they trust us that, one, we're going to make best use of the data, and that's what the primary purpose of this discussion is, how we can fully harvest the knowledge that can be generated from their generosity. But the other thing is, what are we going to give back to them? And maybe we should adopt some principles around that. I felt in the trial that we ran, I just thought we didn't think enough about how we could make sure that everyone who participated in that trial knew what the result of the trial was and what that implication was for society, let alone for them as an individual. It was so easy to have them participate in the trial, to take their data and to call the trial over at the end and just say thank you, mostly to the sites, and not have an individual interaction with the participants and making sure that they understood what had accrued as a result. Similarly, if those participants are interested in working with others to see what's going to happen next, I mean, Sharon's working so much in citizen science, I mean, these data sets are going to be available. They need to know what opportunities there might be if they're truly interested in this topic. Anyway, my message, I guess, is that if one of our goals, academics, industry, everyone who's at stakeholders here, is to show that we are listening and that we want to participate, then we have to be sensitive to that really key comment that you're making in the kind of way in which it will be reflected by society as a whole when they hear us. I could see easily for them to say a bunch of people got together in a small room, talk about how they were going to share data with each other and enrich themselves with opportunities and what's in it for us. And yeah, we hear that they want to do more research for us, but I'm not seeing the connection. So there may need to be a part here that pays a lot of attention to that also, and I just want to thank you for that.
I feel like I'd like to clarify a little bit about what I said, because I think it actually is clear and there should be a standard, and it would be fairly easy to articulate it. I mean, in general, there should be an obligation to inform participants in clinical trials about the result of the trial, and 95% of the time, and in fact this is a standard because the blinding assignments in blinded trials are returned to the sites, 95% of the time it's perfectly right to inform someone what treatment they got, placebo, active treatment, or if there are multiple active treatments, which one and when they got it. The only point I was making is when you do that, you have a second obligation, I think, to do your best to make sure that the participant can put their individual assignment in the context of what a clinical trial is. And that will take some time. The exceptions, I think, are fairly clear. It's when you have a follow-on period to the trial where maintaining the blind, for example, is critical to the scientific purpose, but that requires a reconsent. Otherwise, I think it's a fairly simple standard that ought to be.
Yeah, and I just bet if you audited all the trials, it's more an opt-in than an opt-out. I mean, if people are persistent and come to us, we will tell them, but have we really tried to provide it as a service and make sure that it's easy and that we provide the support you're talking about? It's not just saying, here's what it is, but are we building that kind of bridge? Usually we're done with that trial, we're done with, and we're moving on, and if someone's persistent, we'll do it. And I think you're right, Rob, maybe it just would be nice to think about that as articulating that standard and trying to talk about what best practice is and trying to make sure we're adhering to it.
Yeah, we'll move on to another question, but while we were discussing this more questions came in on the same topic, asking the same thing. So I think what we're hearing, it's very important that we clarify a standard here, expectation, and what can participants expect as well. And I think we'll take that to heart and follow up on that. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Peter, is it on? Peter Doshi, and I guess, sorry to shift back, but as from the perspective of a researcher, and I liked how the discussion already sort of, Dr. Krumholtz talked about moving from whether to share data, but how, and Dr. Berlin immediately responded with a low-hanging fruit of sharing clinical study reports. And, you know, in the course pack for this meeting, I have an article, The Imperative to Share Clinical Study Reports, so I was really happy to hear that. Now, my question is whether we could flesh out, at least in part, because I know time is limited, the details of what that would mean. So, for example, I know that clinical study reports are written to a pretty strict set of guidelines, the E3 document put out by the ICH. And part of the structure of this is to include as an appendix the individual participant data. This is now a printed out PDF version of individual participant data. And so if I have all that data, I really wouldn't know what to do with it, because first I'd have to scan it and then try to convert it back to a database that it originally came from. So it would seem to make sense to bring in the electronic data set as is. So I was wondering if that would be part of the proposal. So I guess the general question is that specifically part of the proposal, and what parts of the CSR are in that offer of the low-hanging fruit? And the other question is this idea to offer clinical study reports to everybody, or is this going to be on a case-by-case basis? The article in the course pack describes our inability to obtain clinical study reports, full clinical study reports from Roche, despite their promise to make them available. Thank you.
So the first part of your question was about the individual patient data, and that's not what we're proposing at the moment. I mean, we're certainly here because we're interested in figuring out the best way to do that. That's not what we're proposing initially. So again, just to be clear, I'm not saying we're not going to disclose individual level data, but that's not what we're talking about when we say clinical study reports. And there's also a lot of stuff in these reports that's, let's say, when some of my FDA friends talk about don't editorialize, just give us the data. So there tends to be some editorializing in some of these. So we're really trying to think of a way to share the clinical study report, the data piece.
Okay. Just to be clear, are you speaking for Janssen? No, I'm just wondering if you're, when you say we, or, I mean, I just mean, do you mean you're talking about your own personal commitment? That I just want to be clear, that's all.
So we're early in our discussions within Janssen. So none of this is official Janssen position yet. This is what we're striving for. This is what we're working toward. We've had some early discussions at some fairly high levels. I don't know if Joanne Waldstreicher wants to add anything to that.
Yeah, I mean, just to add, we are moving towards greater transparency, and we, as a first shot, we are in favor, and we'd like to collaborate to make individual patient data and clinical study report data available. The status that we are in right now with everybody else is because of consent forms, because of information in our clinical study reports. For example, individual patient narratives are in there. So we're here, we're at the table, we want to work together to figure out how to make this happen together, and we're very much in favor of moving forward.
I mean,
I wasn't saying that in an accusatory way. I was just trying to understand if you were speaking on a policy point of view, that's all.
So just a quick follow-up, because I'm not sure that the original question, people fully understood that the clinical study case reforms, to which Dr. Berlin is referring, would not include, obviously, the participant level data, right? So, I mean, just to be very, very clear here.
Right. That's as a first step. that's what we're saying.
So can you help, I was going to say, could you help us understand, maybe there can be a little discussion, what additional would really be gained by making that available? I'm not sure everybody would understand, well, what's really different from that from the publications? You've sort of said there is difference, but I'm not sure people have a real sense of why that's
I
different.
want to make sure and comment on that too after Jeff.
Okay, I should just defer to Rob, who's actually much more experienced at this than I am. I mean, typically what these reports have is a much greater level of detail about methodology. So all of the minute details that might matter to interpreting the results are in the clinical study report. The sensitivity analysis, so we chose a particular statistical approach, but here are the 5 other approaches that might be applied. Here's the detailed table of all the subgroup reports. So if I'm interested in these subgroup effects, I can get those from aggregate level data within the subgroups without needing the individual patient data. So that's really where I'm going with it.
And I just want one point of clarification, not in addition to this, but so I just want to be clear what I'm hearing from Janssen, because Joanne, this is, I think, really important, and I was really inspired by what you told me before, that actually this is, I know it's not official, but the sense is that this is a how, not a what. That is, the company is committed to individual patient level data release, but you're trying to deal with some of the technical issues about what that means, given your consent forms and a variety of other things. I mean, I'm just trying to highlight this. I thought that was remarkable and in a really important statement. And I just wanted to, there's differences between saying culturally we're not ready versus culturally we're ready, but we're now going to have to figure out how. And legitimately, there are, believe me, technical issues here about how this gets done well and fairly and attentive to a lot of different issues.
Yeah, no, I just want to echo that. And I think even with the clinical study report, and that's what we're trying to work through, as well as individual patient data, I think it's really important to hear the patient's perspective on what they want to see in terms of their own data. But we also need to hear the patient's perspective on how we're going to protect their privacy. And the way we have individual patient data now, as well as our study reports, I'm not sure can really accomplish those things. And so we want to work towards that and I think the best way to do it is to collaborate together and really to hear all of the different needs of the different groups, researchers, patients, investigators, et cetera.
So I want to comment on a couple of things that have been said, because I mean, my understanding is the next day and a half are going to cover a lot of these technical issues, which are technical, ethical, cultural, statistical, very complicated, and not worked out at this point, in my view. On the study reports, there are really 2 study reports that need to be made public. One is what the company sends to the FDA. The other is the internal FDA analysis. And I think a lot of people don't understand that right now, if the drug doesn't get on the market, these reports are not available in any form. Our brilliant U.S. Congress has passed laws that really restrict these data from being available unless the company makes them available. What? Yeah.
It's a key point, because people think that it's illegal to make them available. It's illegal for the FDA to make them available. Right. It's not illegal for the company to make them available.
Right. So what's in the study report, as Jesse, I think, very well described, is a lot of detail. And it's critical for people to know that what's in the journal is the end result of sometimes hundreds of decisions about what's included and excluded in terms of patient population, analysis techniques, et cetera. Those are usually covered from the company's perspective in the study report with a lot of editorial and bias. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's the company's job, is to make decisions and defend them. The FDA report, and the FDA, as opposed to the European regulators, actually get the raw data. And the penalties would be so extreme for holding back raw data that it's not often done. The FDA report is often quite different than the company's report because it takes a totally different view, not biased by the company's perspective. It may be biased by someone at the FDA's perspective. So I think those are critical things. But I think what several people have mentioned also, right now, it is the case that if you made the raw data available from these reports, they are identifiable. There are enough characteristics of people in those reports that you could identify individuals. Whether that's good or bad, is another discussion, and I hope it'll be discussed during the course of the day and a half.
So these are very good segues to the following sessions. Maybe we'll continue questions from the floor. Yes, sir.
Hi, it's Jose Galvez. I just want to say first I'm a real advocate of sharing data, both clinical and preclinical data. But what I've seen as a real impediment to the data sharing is working with the academic colleagues is that they're really disincentivized to share data. I mean, the reality is for career advancement, it's authorship, not creation of data, which counts. And so I think one of the big problems we're going to have to tackle is how do we incentivize academics to share data and allow this to count for their academic advancement.
We'll start with our journal editors.
Yes, that was why my proposal was that if you've generated data, you are automatically an author. The only thing that would prevent you from being an author would be if you disagree with the analysis, in which case you're a collaborator. You are always attached to your data, and so is your funder, and so are the trial participants, and so is everybody involved. And the journals need to learn ways to give credit to that. Just because Medline doesn't want to have huge author lists doesn't mean we don't have huge author lists. We handle that quite well, and we're developing actually markup so that we can send your actual author contributions directly to your resume. You know, we are marking up exactly in excruciating detail that this person was the analyst on this person's the designated representative of this consortium, these people contributed equally, these bosses jointly directed the project. There should never be a discussion again about authorship order. I think we need to have really particulate, granular identification of what people actually did in knowledge production. And I think that is where the incentive comes from.
I just say that I think this is a problem in the House of Academics that we have to solve. It's not a journal editor issue. And I also think that it's unwise to think that only the people who generate the data set should be the ones who are going to be writing on it. The people who are writing on it may be at odds with some of the things that were said. There may be the way in which the public dialogue progresses, but the people who generate the data need to get credit for as the progenitors of the substrate, of the reagents that people are using. And that's a House of Academics issue. And maybe there are ways in the journal, even if they haven't written that article, that there's credit and acknowledgement in the article. This was produced by blank. Because really you can't have done that work unless the people had put in that elbow grease, and they deserve great credit for it. And but the current thing is that the people feel ownership. They feel like they can take their time. They feel that they can do it as ever they want, and that leads to slower. Some groups are extraordinarily productive, like Rob's, who really were producing quickly and rapidly from the trials, and others publish one thing out of the trial, and it takes years and years for anything else to come out. And we've got to change this game in academics. We have got a big problem.
Yeah, clearly there needs to be a mechanism that's carefully thought through that allows credit to accrue back to the people who do the actual very, very hard work of clinical trials. And I think it's already an underappreciated business. If you do a trial and do it well, it takes a huge amount of effort, and you get a couple of publications out of it, maybe. Take the example, though, which is somewhat similar to what we're talking about, of people who do meta-analyses and systematic reviews. They churn them out, and they're all based on work that has been done by other people. So I think we already have a system in which the people who do the hard work of clinical trials are not recognized to the extent they should be. But Dr. Krumholtz is right. I think you can really lay this at the door of the academic medical establishment, because journal publications are the currency of academic promotion. And until that problem is solved, and there are ways of recognizing people not just for the number of publications they have or the impact factor of the journals in which they publish, but for the work that their work has led to, for the importance of studies and work that is done based on things that they laid the foundation for.
Labors in the fields of actually doing clinical trials. You guys have made my day because I used to go to meetings with Deborah 5 or 6 years ago where I'd be the only trialist in the room. There would be a bunch of meta-analysts who I just felt like all they wanted was for me to work for 10 years and then hand over my data set. So without doing any work, they could sit at their computer and write a dozen papers, often misinterpreting the context of the trial and the details of what the data definitions actually were. So I was also particularly excited to hear Miles's proposal that there needs to be, the progenitors here are the parents. They need to still watch over their children to some extent. Now, they shouldn't control their children in this case, but to ignore the real fundamental knowledge of why the trial was done, what the patient population was, and how the data were collected and stored is a huge mistake that I see over and over again. Deborah now, it's turnabout is fair play. Now that she's in charge of clinicaltrials.gov, we frequently talk about really stupid submissions to journals that we're reviewing that where people didn't understand how the data got into clinicaltrials.gov, and they make really bad decisions about their analyses because of that.
This was very good. Dr. Rosenblatt?
Yes, I wanted to sort of pick up on this theme of the dissemination of the information that you get by revisiting data sets, and I think this conversation has been very good at kind of highlighting some of the issues for an academic look at this. But I think one of the realities as we open up data much more widely is that, and I want to take advantage of having journal editors here, is that not everybody who's going to be looking at the data cares one way or the other as to whether it'll lead to a peer-reviewed publication. People will be going into these data sets for many different reasons, and they may not choose to go to your journals and subject it to rigorous peer review and dissemination through carrying the kind of imprimatur of some of your journals. And so we haven't at all talked about, once you get this data, how do you make it available in a responsible way, and what are the standards? I think Dr. Axton talked about that a little bit, about having a hypothesis and peer review, but how do we do that? Once we open the data set, how do we make sure that it's reported in ways that are responsible, even if they're not necessarily going through your particular organizations?
It's a very good question. Could we have let's have a quick response to that, and then we'll take one more question from the floor. So this issue of how do we ensure responsible utility of the data that's made more widely available, perhaps not just it being published in the article in the newspaper.
So I was criticizing the otherwise rather good NIH data access committees because they're slow. The assumption is that the government paid for a truckload of sand, it goes into a sand repository, and then you're not allowed to use it unless you go through all kinds of hoops. I was proposing the opposite of that, which is that the data holders have an obligation to share the data, but that they are always the generator of that data, and the assumption should be that anybody qualified with a good idea gets a chance to look at that data. If they're rebuffed, then we should have an ombudsman committee, which is partly the data generators, partly independent people, and partly research participants, to help redirect the sort of research so that it becomes acceptable use. In other words, it protects the research subjects, it has a useful research question, and that could then be accepted. So that was my model.
So I have a related question, though. That doesn't protect against someone writing, let's just say someone writes a flawed or stupid analysis that gets into some journal. And Rob is right, I have been living this a little bit with clinicaltrials.gov data. Papers can get rejected at top journals, but they show up in the news, and I know it's flawed. But I don't have time to rebut every silly analysis, just like a company wouldn't necessarily have time to be a police about the analysis of their data. Is it sufficient to just let open science take care of itself? In other words, criticism will occur, and it can occur because the data are open, or do you need some other mechanism?
Right, and the concern would be that these go on to live in the internet and never go away.
Right.
Right, so you're talking about people who maybe don't do a good job analyzing the data, and you're discussing a related problem, which is those get rejected from good journals some of the times, not always, but then they appear elsewhere. in their original form. And that's something we regret to see too when we reject papers, that we make comments and then they're not taken on board. That's a problem in part, I think, that journals are well placed to solve by trying to link all commentary about a paper back to the original study. And I'm confident there are mechanisms to do that. But beyond that, also publishing peer review and commentary alongside the paper in a way that can always be linked back to the clinical trial. Certainly it's possible to imagine lots of scenarios in which bad analyses of data have a lot of currency and popularity among the population. But I think taking the long view, that is likely to be transient, and that we should have confidence in the fact that eventually science is self-correcting, maybe not within 5 years or 10 years. I don't think we should be afraid of having multiple competing analyses out there because, as Peter Gotcha said, we don't want to live in a society where there's only one version of the truth. And I think the anxiety that we feel about many different people looking at the data and coming up with different interpretations is somewhat misplaced. I don't think we should be afraid of that future. Now, journals will certainly play an important role in sorting through competing analyses.
Right. Well, if I could follow up, I think that the peer-reviewed journals, which are at the kind of top of the food chain, nevertheless are a smaller and smaller slice of the dissemination of information.
I would like to make a very strong comment about this. I'm very in favor of data liberation, but if you're talking about self-correcting science with inanimate objects in a lab or even preclinical science, there are not many consequences. But much of this is going to happen outside of journals, much like paparazzi, and there will be consequences of people being killed by poor use of data. Because if it hits the news, a lot of our people will stop taking their medications or whatever it is based on what's in the news. And so you can kill people with bad science very quickly. 5 years is too long. It's a problem that we're going to have to grapple with.
So I suggest that we return to some of these themes. Since we're on the internet and the timing is very important, I'm afraid we are going to have to close this session. Thank all the panelists, the speakers, and the audience for a very useful opening session. Thank you.